Welcome to our Financing for Development Google Hangout. Whether it's your morning, afternoon, or evening, we welcome you. For those of you who are live, we're delighted that you can participate. For those of you who are seeing us on delay, we welcome you and hope you will enjoy this session. I am Scott White, one of the instructors for our MOOC. I will be your facilitator today, and we are really extremely delighted and privileged to have two development experts with us as panelists today. I will allow them to introduce themselves, but we have Rebecca Young from the International Monetary Fund and Homi Karas from Brookings Institution. The format for today is the following. We are delighted with the number of posts and questions that you posed to us. In fact, when I last checked, there were over 335 posts and questions that you all had presented to us. Our cup truly runneth over. And as is true in life, there are more questions than answers. We're not going to be able to handle very many questions today, but we will endeavor to deal with some of your questions through new threads that we will set up in the discussion forum for the MOOC. We will take a number of the questions that you presented in advance. Then for those of you who are tweeting live questions, about 20 or 25 minutes into this session, we will then take a number of your live questions, and then we will return to a few more of your questions at the end, pre-presented questions at the end. Let me, please, when you tweet, identify your country. If you feel comfortable, identify your first name. That would be useful. Just a little bit of background. You should know that there are almost 25,000 participants in this MOOC. We're really pleased by that participation level. You represent 197 countries, including one person who says he or she is from Antarctica. We would like that person to identify him or herself if that's the case. But it's tremendous representation, so we're very pleased. Without further ado, let me ask Rebecca and Homi please to introduce themselves, and then we will turn to the first question.
Thank you, Scott. I'd just like to first add a disclaimer that if I happen to say something particularly brilliant, please quote me as my personal views, not my employer or my government. I would like to give you a little bit of background as to where my views come from. Currently, I am working for the IMF. Before that, the Canadian government in the development financing space. But before that, I actually worked for a business lobby group of CEOs supporting sustainable development, and prior to that in the mining industry. So I've looked at these issues from a variety of angles. If I can just sort of share a couple of my observations before we get started. And one is that the landscape is ever evolving. And so, you have a definition now that involves development finance. It's not static though, it'll continue to change. The concepts are increasingly mainstream. If you look at the participants, the breadth and where folks are coming from, it touches almost all disciplines as it should. I guess one takeaway from that, though, is that there are many of us in the sandbox, and so it's learning how to play together, how to really be greater than the sum of our parts when we're working together. Just a final observation would be that really when we talk about these challenges, that there is no panacea, there is no silver bullet. So, there are always different opinions, different perspectives, but it's going to take all and more than what we have on the table with some of these challenges.
Thank you, Rebecca. Homi, we turn to you.
Thank you. My name is Homi Karas. I'm a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. I've been there for 8 years. Before that, I was at the World Bank Group for 26 years, and my last position was as the chief economist of the East Asia and Pacific region. So I've really been thinking about development finance now for a little bit over 30 years. A few years ago, I had the privilege of being the lead author of a report on the Sustainable Development Goals that was presented by a high-level panel of eminent persons to the UN's Secretary General. And in that report, we identified financing as being one of the principal obstacles to actually achieving the very ambitious Sustainable Development Goals. So this question about where will the financing come from, which is a question that to some extent was addressed at the UN's conference on financing for development at Addis Ababa in July of this year, is really something which is central. And I think what's new is that financing for development is no longer just simply something that happens from government to government or from a multilateral agency to a government. Financing for development now happens at many different levels. It's about business financing, bank financing, financing directly to households, as well as the government financing. So I think that we now have a very rich array of different issues to pursue.
Well, thank you both. This is a great kickoff to the session. Let us now turn to a few of the questions, of the many questions, for which we really are delighted, let me say again, to have gotten such a strong response that we've gotten from our participants. I'm going to start with a question that was posed by Purev Naransetseg, who and several others also made similar comments to the effect that they want to know, how does financing for development work when a country has difficulty sorting out its development priorities? And we'll leave aside for the moment conflict-affected or fragile states, but let's focus on the bulk of countries who are grappling with limited finance to meet their development goals. I will hasten to point out that in Module 2, we have a video from Colombian Deputy Finance Minister Andres Escobar, who refers to Colombia's National Development Plan. So that's an example of a country that is being very systematic, one of any number of countries that will be systematic in terms of how they implement the SDGs. But in many countries, process is not defined that way. So we appreciate your perspectives on how, as international financiers, whether they be international financial institutions or from the private sector, they deal with the situation in countries where the development priorities are not clearly spelled out.
Well, I think that's an excellent question to start off on, because it is really the pre-step before you get to financing, because ultimately what we've learned over time is that ownership of these priorities is key by the countries. And so certainly financiers are looking for these priorities. And over the years, there have been different tools, whether it's a national development plan or a poverty reduction strategy paper. These are the sorts of tools that institutions like the World Bank or the IMF can support countries in developing these priorities. And so these plans, they can include, for example, sort of a macroeconomic approach for the country, structural reform, social policy. It can help them tease out some of the main priorities within those countries and where can they get the greatest growth, where can they ensure sustainability and poverty reduction within the slew of these policies. Part of this focus or prioritization is also then enabling them to elaborate their financing needs. And so it's a very useful tool then to allow financiers to see where they fit into the picture and where they can best enable these countries. I should say an important part of developing these priorities, though, is the engagement of civil society. And so clearly these priorities should not be set in a dark room by country officials without engagement from the outside. So that's something that financiers look for as well, to see what sort of input is coming from stakeholders in establishing these plans. I just add a final element to this priority setting exercise and why it is important even before the financing comes in. One would be it provides a bit of an accountability that these priorities are out there and civil society, citizens can really hold their institutions, their governments to account. I alluded, it also allows stakeholders, the financiers themselves, to coordinate and see where they best fit. So there are just a few thoughts on that question, Scott.
Thank you. Homi?
So ultimately, priorities in most countries are set through their budget. Almost all countries have a budget that says this is how much the government is going to spend. And in that budget, there is the articulation of a number of development projects and programs. So there are two types of development financing in general. One is budget financing, where the budget is there, it's publicly available, sometimes it's approved by a parliament or some other kind of legislative body, but it's transparent and public. Other times, one has the budget, but the budget may not have gone through such strict processes, and so people don't necessarily feel that the budget spending is aligned with development priorities. There may be all kinds of other concerns that governments are trying to, objectives that governments are trying to accomplish. And there, I think, development financing becomes a little bit more opportunistic. You see the ability to be able to, for example, move forward on an infrastructure project where bottlenecks are very visible. I think power generation is a typical example where one can see that if people don't have access to energy, it's very difficult to pursue development. So the second type of development finance is really project finance. And they're the financial intermediaries themselves, organizations like the World Bank or bilateral aid agencies, often do a lot of the project preparation themselves in conjunction with government officials. But those kinds of projects, I would say, are really just a stepping stone to the desired form of development finance, which is really ultimately to go through budgets and to respect priorities that are determined, as Rebecca has said, in a broad consultative way with civil society in a country.
Thank you, Homi. I just will add a comment, I think, to what both have said to indicate that organizations like the World Bank have an ongoing dialogue with their member countries, the borrowing member countries, and engage in something called a country partnership strategy, which is an iterative process, a back and forth process through which hopefully some of these development priorities are defined. But both of you touched upon an aspect of development, almost a tension, I'll call it, that I want to come to as the second question. And that has to do with the fact that multilateral development banks, the IMF, providers of official development assistance and others often work top-down through governments, not always, but often work through governments. But often the results of the financing are said to be almost invisible or not seen so well at the local level or community level, the fruits of those discussions and the financing. So the question that has been asked in various forums by any number of participants, including Olusegun Olusola of Nigeria, David from the Netherlands, Jesus Bolivian from Spain, and Tan van Nguyen, who is a Vietnamese-American national. The question they posed are, what do these financiers do to try to ensure results are felt at the local level and that the local level participants are actually included in the consultative process so that they have an impact on the development priorities?
That's a great question, because increasingly so much of development is now actually being managed at the local level rather than at the national level. And that's true in countries with federal systems as well as countries with unitary systems. So well over half of the population of developing countries now lives in cities, and much more than half of the GDP, the value produced in developing countries is from cities. So the way in which cities are managed and how cities evolve over time has really become one of the largest challenges for development success. And we don't actually have very well-developed channels for getting money from outside sources to cities. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One reason is that in the past, many cities have actually over-borrowed. They've taken money, they've built investments, but they haven't been able to generate the revenues, and they don't have a revenue base to be able to repay their loans. And so in country after country, and that continues to this day, even in developed countries, cities can often run into trouble in terms of their debt. Here in the United States, we've just had an example of Puerto Rico having very serious problems in repaying its debts. It borrowed heavily in order to implement projects on the island, but it has not been able to recover revenues. So when that happens, not surprisingly, national governments are forced to step in and then take over the repayments. And that generates real tension and stresses on the finances of a country. So many countries have chosen to restrict borrowing at local levels and to insist that any borrowing at local levels actually gets channeled through central government with central government approval. But that creates bottlenecks and delays. So for people who are interested in moving forward fast, in giving cities greater autonomy, it can be quite frustrating. So I think this is still an issue that that we have. It's not easy to solve, and I think we're a long way from ensuring that there is a reasonably frictionless way of moving money to local levels.
I think I would add just one point on there, and it's two elements to the question. One is the financier invisible working through governments, and I would say they should be. You pointed, Homie, that we should be trying to work through the institutions, work through the existing budgets. So the temptation, if you're not seeing the dollar at the end of the pipeline or the service or the result, the temptation might be to go to a parallel route. So I just kind of reinforce in that element of the question that very well the financiers should be kind of invisible, working through the existing systems, whether it's at sort of a federal or a state or a municipal level using the existing systems. But what happens when you don't see those results? And so there are a number of things that that can be done, and this is where support in terms of capacity building or institution building. It might be a lack of capacity in expenditure management and the ability to collect taxes, or it might be in fact corruption. And so there, if you diagnose a situation, why aren't the results appearing? And that's sort of from a high level. And then, of course, obviously, when you get down to a project level, you can certainly have, very clearly articulated outcomes or results that you're looking for. You can have different checks and balances in how you set up a relationship or how you set up a program, so that you know what the results you're aiming for. You have reporting, you have open conversation, and you have evaluation to learn next time how you might improve.
One of the things that's been quite successful in this regard is citizen scorecards, where governments actually publicly announce that they are transferring this amount of money to a school or a project or something like that. And what we found is that when that is visible and easily accessible to citizens, that the money then magically does seem to appear at the local level. Whereas before, when these processes were less transparent, much of the money just simply disappeared and was siphoned off in this long chain between the national treasury and local government levels. So I think that transparency also has a big role to play.
Thank you both for those comments. I just want to pick up on your last point, Homie, in that it seems to me that there are institutions like the World Bank who, through their lending instruments, do try to encourage civil society participation and the creation, in some cases, of civil society organizations. I wonder if you might offer a brief comment on the extent to which promotion of that kind of accountability at the local level is done by international financiers as part of their dialogue with governments.
Well, I think it's done to a certain degree, but I still think that the principal relationship between most development financial institutions and developing countries themselves is through the national government. And that is often a constraint. Even in the World Bank, when there is lending to municipalities, by and large, the World Bank demands a guarantee from the national government. And that can actually work against the financial structures that national governments are trying to put in place, where they want local governments to be more autonomous financially and not to involve and engage the national government. So this is still very difficult territory, I think, for everyone.
Of course, that's a restriction in the charter of the World Bank, which is to say it either lends to governments or guarantees by governments. Rebecca,
I just pick up on the point of engagement, and just from another angle really is that as financiers, we're always looking at the risks. And so one of the risks is that you provide financing to a government to carry out a policy objective or a program objective, only to find out that it's either not needed or not desired by the population. And so, even from that perspective, it is very important that we see demonstrable evidence that there has been effective engagement of stakeholders.
And just one small correction, Scott. IDA, the soft lending window of the World Bank Group, does not actually have to lend to governments, nor does it require a government guarantee in its charter.
Good. No, thank you. That's an important clarification between the IBRD, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which gives more market-based loans to middle-income countries, and IDA. Absolutely. I do want to add that in week 2, you'll hear in particular in the videos by Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, a former finance minister from Nigeria, discussion of both transparency in the budgeting process and the role of subnationals. So you may look for that in week 2. I set aside earlier the question of how to handle development financing in fragile and conflict-affected states, but Marian Kimani of Kenya had raised this as a question. So I wonder if you could comment on the approach that's handled in those situations. We've already said in our overview that much official development assistance is provided in those countries as opposed to expecting the private sector to weigh in. But I wonder if you could both comment on this.
Yeah, I'll provide a few reflections on that. And I mean, certainly these are very difficult situations for financiers to look at, for donors to look at, as to how can we support these countries, these populations. And clearly from what we've learned over time is that one of the first steps is really supporting the peace building or the institution building step, and so really establishing some credible legitimacy in governance structures there, because before you can even start flowing funds, well, I should first say that humanitarian assistance absolutely in the immediate aftermath of crises, whether it's through different UN organizations, there is that immediate financing. But in terms of financing to support government programs, to support that, you certainly have to establish these institutions and the capacities within the institutions, which may be very fragile, very weak, despite their legitimate power. So that tends to be a very critical first step before anything else. I think another thing that we've learned over time is how do you enable some quick wins with financing? So how do you enable these weaker governments to establish some credibility and some support to undertake some of the longer reform measures that are needed, certainly whether it is to create a more enabling environment to attract the private sector financing that ultimately would be required in the longer term, whether it is to provide on their own social services. So how do they manage their expenditures and their revenues? So these would be more of the medium to longer term, but ultimately I think what we're finding is that it is a sustained engagement process. Yes, we do, need to support quick wins with grant financing. There's no expectation in these cases that there will be a return on the financing, but to try to get to a point where there could be other sorts of financing. Given the focus of this course on financing, I would just notice sort of an emerging type of financing that is coming into play in some situations of fragility is the concept of risk financing. And so this would provide some sorts of guarantees to try to attract private sector, acknowledging that there's considerable risk given the present. So these are just some of the new types of engagements that we're all testing.
Conflict-affected countries have grouped together and developed something called the New Deal, which sets out different types of engagement that they are looking for from their external financial partners in their countries. And there are 5 principles of that New Deal, and one of the principles is that financing should actually support conflict-affected countries' governments in boosting their own domestic revenues. At the end of the day, what conflict-affected countries need is to demonstrate that the government in charge actually has a good social compact with the population. So establishing that social compact through projects is extremely important. What that means is that financing should always be done in conjunction with governments, not seen as being external donor-driven projects, because otherwise you don't develop that same kind of social compact. And then the other thing I think that we've now got quite a lot of experience with is that community-driven projects can be quite successful in conflict-affected situations. So there have been very large programs starting in Indonesia, something called the Kecamatan Development Program that was very active in Aceh province when there was an insurgency there. It's the same kind of project has continued in the Philippines, in Mindanao. It's been tried in Brazil with smallholder producers. It's moved to Afghanistan with local funds being given to communities. So these community-driven projects, which are small-scale projects, usually individually running at the $10,000 to $20,000 level, have proven to be extremely effective in conflict-affected states.
Well, thank you both for that. I want to turn to one more question before we look to some of the live tweets that have come in and take several of those questions. Both of you have alluded to it a bit in your previous comments, and that is a major question that's come up from any number of participants. It's both governance and anti-corruption, I'd say, and it's been raised by people such as Kandar Ahmed of Bangladesh, and Sagren Pillay of South Africa, and as I said, many others. How do finance providers ensure that funds go for the purposes intended and are not diverted to other uses or stolen? And what are processes in country to help try to ensure there isn't misappropriation of funding? Just a minor topic. Could you care to?
Well, obviously, you have to have strong financial management in every country if you hope to actually see good development results coming from finance. Finance is just it's a tool, it's an instrument, it's not the end result. So having transparent budgets, having well-developed procurement practices, having audit trails and strengthening supreme audit institutions. All of these are mechanisms for ensuring that the funds go to the places where they're intended. I believe that transparency has actually been quite effective. I think that the more that people see what is supposed to be transferred where, then they can also help governments to keep track of the flow of funds. And so investigative media, civil society organizations, and others have also had a role to play. In some countries with strong civil society organizations like the Philippines, you actually see some quite dramatic effects from involving local citizens. So the degree of corruption in the procurement of textbooks in the Philippines education system, I think, has come down very, very substantially as a result of direct involvement and engagement by the Boy Scouts of the Philippines. So that's the kind of example, I think, which is very practically yielding results. Of course, corruption continues to be an issue, but I think the old days where there were jokes about, well, this money came in for a bridge, and can you see the bridge? No, because that's where the all of the money has actually gone overseas. Those kinds of days in most countries, I think, are behind us, and corruption is actually taking much more sophisticated forms, which are becoming more difficult to detect by these kinds of straightforward means.
I'll just add a few points, and one, it always comes back to the institutions in the first instance. Do the institutions have the tools and the framework at least to minimize the opportunity for corruption, for graft? And so, a starting place is always first to do that assessment. Something that has been very useful, Homie, which you speak of, are some of the transparency initiatives, whether it's, for example, the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, which has been very useful to the extent of what's happening to the revenues that are being generated from the extractive industry. You have anti-money laundering, counter-terrorist financing regulation as well. So obviously, first you want to build the capacity on a preventative basis, but then we do have, whether it's voluntary guidelines, standards to regulation to try to force compliance. I'd add just one more point, and that's more of a selling point on how do you bring down corruption, and that's trying to quantify the cost of corruption on an economy. And so not just the transparency of the dollars not going there, but what is the opportunity cost of that corruption, particularly for attracting business. And so a lot of work that's going on around enabling business environment and transparency indicators. Certainly private sector that's looking in are often looking at these indicators to see whether this is a place they want to do business or not. And so, to be able to quantify the impact on that, I think, can be very useful as well, a useful motivator to do something.
As we can hear, we understand the concept of corruption or anti-corruption transparency is very much intertwined with the issue of effective financing for development, but it's such a huge topic, it would merit sidetracking into a very long discussion. I encourage you all to continue on the discussion forums, a dialogue on anti-corruption and governance. But perhaps someday we'll have a MOOC on the subject. I should also add that the World Bank Group and the other multilaterals have their own sanction systems to try to bar firms when fraud and corruption in projects evidence of it is found through an administrative process they have. But the most important prophylactic protective measure is in the design of projects, the way funds are dispersed, for there to be measures in place that try to minimize the likelihood that funds can be diverted. Let us now turn to some of your tweets. I understand from colleagues here there's been very active tweeting going on, so let us take a number of your tweets. Have tweets from Walid Hassan from Pakistan, from Henry, location unknown, and others involving the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. Can some countries reject some or all of the SDGs? In other words, is there optionality for them? And a companion question, which feeds into a larger question, I'd say, which is how will the SDGs be monitored to ensure that all countries are meeting the targets? Or to put it another way, if I may, what monitoring evaluation is done to ensure effective financing for development, not just the money goes out, but the money is being used to help achieve the SDGs?
Well, actually, all countries have already agreed to all of the Sustainable Development Goals. This was one of the great achievements at the United Nations Summit in September. And there was a very intense process of negotiation among countries in order to arrive at a document where everyone felt that these goals did represent a universal agenda for development. I think it is important to understand that many of the Sustainable Development Goals are actually intertwined with each other. It's very difficult to achieve one without making progress on others. So the idea that one can just pick and choose, I think, is not something that is easily supported. That said, among the Sustainable Development Goals, different ones will have a different urgency in different countries. And there, I think that there is plenty of scope for countries to figure out where do they really need to put their immediate efforts, and where are they doing slightly better, and where they just need to continue to do what they're doing. In terms of the monitoring, there is now a new phase of trying to identify indicators for each of the targets that underlie each of the goals. That work should be finished by April of next year, and then there will be UN agencies to actually make sure that some of the data is actually monitored in order to see how well each country is doing. That said, in some areas, there are data gaps, and our current data systems don't provide the information that's going to be required for the indicators, and many agencies are now looking at that and trying to put in place measures to make sure that those data gaps are filled. I think it's important also to realize that the old language of monitoring and accountability, which has the implication that somehow countries are forced to do something, is giving way to much softer language of review and follow-up. So the goals will be reviewed, people will look at them, there will be discussions about them, but I think that there's a realization that hard accountability, meaning sanctions or rewards for achieving certain things, really has not played a very important or useful role. And what's much more useful is to have a dialogue and partnership and greater cooperation among countries.
I would only add, I'd reinforce what an enormous accomplishment it was to achieve the adoption of these goals. Very comprehensive, very ambitious. Reading between the lines in some of the questions, I think then is on implementation. So we've got these great goals. Now, how do we ensure follow through? And I think this is where this course is very pertinent in terms of financing for development, because frankly, a lot of the goals will require some sort of financing, whether it's greater domestic revenue mobilization, whether it's economic growth, greater private sector activity, and then back to some of the more traditional financing, external financiers in terms of donors or multilaterals. So I think that that this is where over the next couple of modules it will be very interesting to dive deeper into just how do we support countries in their ambitions to meet these goals.
Well, thank you both for those perspectives. I guess I will add that any number of participants have asked about what evaluation has been done of the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, and that there are resources both in our week one and also participants have shared evaluation reports that have been done on the MDGs to see in terms of the impact that the MDGs had, or the achievement of the MDGs, I should say, in various countries. Another question that we've gotten from Ted from USA is, what can we, as individuals, do, or perhaps community organizations, at the local level? What are first steps? This, of course, is at the opposite end from the country dialogue we were talking about. So it would be very useful for you to give some sense as to what you think individual participants can do to help, I would say, to help countries along the path of achieving the SDGs, or in general for sustainable development, to promote it.
Well, I can provide a couple of comments. I think if we're talking, looking at the breadth of participants, people are sitting in different job functions. So, in first through your own work, whether you were in private sector looking at opportunities in emerging markets, or whether you're in a donor country looking at how to deliver more effective aid, I think there are contributions on the job that you can provide based on the learnings through this course. Another way of interpreting that question, I think, though, is, as a citizen, what can you do at a local level? And from that perspective, certainly holding your government to account, I think, on fulfilling their own commitments. And not just holding them to account, but also feeding into the policy-making process. That certainly, that's, many of us are fortunate to live in countries where there are consultative processes, and so be sure to feed into those. Use your vote. I think if you're a participant in civil society activities, I think that can also make an important difference. So I think, I always have defined my approach to development as quite pragmatic, and I kind of consider, kind of using a broom and poking until I find some give. And so I think that sort of approach, you have to be persistent, you have to try different things, but the important thing is to keep trying.
I think one of the things that can be done at the local level is really to build awareness about the Sustainable Development Goals. It's actually quite shocking that in polls, only about 4% of Americans actually knew that there was such a thing as the Millennium Development Goals. And if you don't have public awareness and public support, then you also won't have leadership, whether that's in governments, or whether it's in business, or whether it's in civil society organizations. You won't have leadership paying sustained attention to these goals. And in the evaluation of the Millennium Development Goals, the single thing that emerged time and again as a constraining factor was the difficulty in sustaining political leadership over time. Political leaders have so many different items on their agenda that they are often reactive. It's the crisis of the day. And when there are big summits of the United Nations, as there have been this year, development looms high on the agenda. And then when the summits go away, development issues fall off the agenda. And development finance follows exactly that same pattern. It's very volatile. It goes up and down from year to year, in sector to sector. And yet we all know that development is something that requires long-term, systematic, stable engagement. You can't make a 15-year plan which the Sustainable Development Goals are, with volatile financing. And you won't get stable financing if you don't have political leadership that is determined and committed. And you won't get political leadership that's determined and committed if you don't have strong public awareness and public demand for that. So I believe that one of the most important things that everybody individually can do is to make sure that people are aware of the Sustainable Development Goals and to ask the question, what can I do in my daily life in order to advance these goals? Every business, every organization, every government can do something to move these goals forward.
You will hear some of the themes that have just been articulated echoed again in the third week when we focus on private sector finance, where private sector financiers refer to the need for stability, consistency, a long-term approach from government entities and the like. Also, I would add that we do have a modest aspiration as the World Bank sponsors of this MOOC that the networks of communities that are being established through the discussion forums in this MOOC will have some long-lasting impact, that once you all get to know one another on the basis of your interactions over this 4-week period, that there is strength in numbers, that you can continue to give ideas to each other and perhaps take ideas to your local communities and identify areas where you all can participate, or send your ideas to local officials or to national officials to have an impact. So we do hope that some community of interested individuals will, with communities of interest, will be established through this MOOC. We have a question from TY, unknown location, that's asking each of you, what is the most innovative financing system or tool that you've seen in development?
Well, I'll tackle this one. This is a bit of an area that's very close to my heart, and so I'm not going to just pick one. I know that many of you, or all of you by now, should have read Billions to Trillions, and so you've seen some examples in there. And so I think, over the years, I've seen a few interesting concepts emerging that have led to projects, and one really is around attracting greater private sector participation in this space, and how do you really draw them in, particularly in countries or markets where, quite frankly, there are rampant market failures that don't allow them to appropriate sufficient profits, so they just don't enter those markets. So, so some tools like the Advanced Market Commitment for vaccines is a really interesting concept to how, as donors, can you provide just enough of a financial incentive to compensate for some of the risk in the types of investment in R&D that are needed to overcome disease that affects developing country populations. So I find this concept of using very limited donor funding to really leverage up or draw in private sector, particularly in sectors where, quite frankly, private sector has the know-how, they have the tools and the expertise to come up with the solutions. And so, that's certainly one area that I think is, we're seeing a lot of testing, a lot of results coming back from early work in areas that have ripe potential for scale up. And, a concept to keep in mind is this leverage really, is taking that, the limited donor dollars and really scaling them up with private sector dollars. A touch on another area that's quite interesting in social innovation, and that's around sort of the behavioral aspect. And so how do you address some of the challenges that we've seen in past to development financing that have run into hurdles? And I would say even in the local financing level, we've seen, for example, innovations where lending circles among women in certain areas can really both create better outcomes and also better returns on the lending. And so I'd say, those are just a couple of broad areas, but certainly a space to watch.
There's a company called Give Directly, which is basically a technological platform Individuals can give money to give directly, and they transfer money through SMS messages to mobile handsets of the poorest people in some of the poorest countries that they have identified by using local communities and systems to make sure that only the poorest people actually receive the money. They're able to get 97 cents on the dollar to the poorest people in the world. That's something very dramatic. In most other processes, by the time the money goes through various intermediaries that have due diligence, they have to pay the administrative costs of the people who work on projects, there are all kinds of processes that have to be followed. On average, there have been calculations that only about 40 cents on the dollar of official development assistance actually reach the ultimate beneficiary. So if you can go from 40 cents on the dollar to 97 cents on the dollar, you're doing something very dramatic. I think that that's one of the most promising sources of new types of financing using new technology that I've seen. There's another company called Kiva.org that's in the micro lending space. In just 3 years, Kiva was able to bundle together small donations, $50 per person, things like that, and become a larger microfinance lender in developing countries than USAID that had almost 30 years of experience in building up their programs in this space. So with new technological platforms, I think innovation is exploding, and it is permitting finance to actually get to the poorest people in ways that were unimaginable just a few years ago.
Well, thank you both for these great examples. Rebecca, I'll say the AMC, the Advanced Market Commitment, is an innovative instrument that Susan McAdams, one of our instructors, will be covering in video, which appears in week 4. And only we'll see whether we're stealing our own thunder, but I'm hoping we will have time still during this hangout, whose end I think is rapidly approaching, to come back to the use of modern technology, the way you've described it, to help the development process and to engage people at the community level and assure large percentage of the funds do get to the intended projects. Let's take one more tweet at this point, and then let's return to a couple of the previous questions posed. Samita from Nepal asks, what do you think were she calls them loopholes, I think, and call them shortcomings or development spots in the MDGs? And are we using recognition of those shortcomings to improve the SDGs? In other words, the SDGs take advantage of lessons learned from the MDGs?
Well, I think they certainly do. And let me just give you a couple of examples. There was no discussion in the Millennium Development Goals of energy. And we all know that it's almost impossible to develop without also developing modern energy systems. There was no discussion of governance or institutions or peace and the importance of resolving some of these terrible conflicts that we see around the world. There's now a Sustainable Development Goal on that. It's Goal 16. There was no discussion of jobs. There was no discussion of inequality. So many of the things that I think almost everybody would agree are critically important for development are now explicitly included as one or more of the Sustainable Development Goals. The other thing that I think has happened with the Sustainable Development Goals is that they have moved from the idea that these are global goals. So let's halve global poverty much of which could be accomplished by progress in a couple of large countries like China, India, and Vietnam, to the concept of leave no one behind, which literally means that we have to make progress in every country and in every community within every country. So having some spaces that are just simply ignored or left out is no longer going to be enough in order to be able to satisfy or to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. And in a number of areas, these so-called zero targets are very powerful drivers of making sure that disenfranchised communities, lagging regions within countries are now given much more voice. I think that's a very important new development.
I would only add a very broad reflection in that, yes, we have new goals, but we're the same people, the same planet, and so presumably tremendous learning. And so we've had some countries that have done very well in terms of meeting the MDGs and others that haven't. So we have a wealth of knowledge and insight as to what works well and what doesn't. And so, I mean, I think it's both an encouragement and a call to use some of those learnings to be sure that we apply them to the implementation of the SDGs.
Well, thank you both for that. The end of our hour is rapidly approaching. We just have a couple of minutes left. Let me offer a comment, the last tweet, final tweet from Anton Mark J, who says, finance is a tool, not an end result. Something we absolutely applaud, we fully agree, and financing for development, our focus on it is to help explain the tools that are being used to promote sustainable development. Let me turn to a last question, and if I may, I alluded to it a couple of minutes ago. If you both could offer your comments on the question that Lily, she describes herself as a Brit based in Singapore, has raised about the impact that big data and the Internet of Things may have on the development agenda, how it could provide opportunities to accelerate the SDGs in ways that might not have seemed possible until recently, and through the use of instruments that might not have been possible. I appreciate the examples you just gave a couple of minutes ago. If we can kind of expand on this notion, it'd be a good way to end.
Well, I'll just say first on big data, if you have any ideas, this is a great question. In fact, the IMF has just launched the Big Data Challenge, asking precisely that and open sourcing it. And so I think that is one of the benefits of technology now, is that the ability to source ideas and funding, as we hear, from a much broader base on much shorter timelines. We're seeing, many examples of how technology is delivering faster, better results. We mentioned just a few, from whether it's remitting money very quickly from one part of the world to another, whether it's using apps to detect disease, whether it's taking training virtually, bringing the training to the individual instead of the individual to the building, to the office. So we're seeing all sorts of examples of how this really can influence faster, better results. I would say, though, that we're just touching the tip of the iceberg, and certainly, in terms of meeting a lot of these goals, it's going to require a whole lot more innovation, a whole lot more of leveraging technology, and along with that comes a need for a culture of learning and a culture of failure, ability to accept that we're going to try some things and some of them aren't going to work, and having the ability to learn from that and apply it going forward. But I would say, it's absolutely critical that we leverage this going forward.
This is such an exciting time, I think. We have today something like 2.5 billion people in the world without a bank account. We have 500 million small enterprises with no bank accounts. With modern technology, in 10 years' time, that gap is going to be gone. Everyone who wants a bank account will be able to get a bank account through mobile phone technologies. These technologies already exist. And when that happens, the ability to do all kinds of different things in development will be enormous. You might ask, what's this got to do with big data? One of the things it's got to do with big data is that you are not allowed to have a bank account today anywhere in the world without satisfying a regulation called Know Your Customer. Know Your Customer means that you have to have information and data about individuals, and poor people very often have a great deal of difficulty in doing this. But with new technologies, you can have biometric identification systems which will permit that and which will overcome this. The other big data that I think offers enormous promise that is very exciting is geospatial imaging. We will, by next year, be able to take pictures of the entire world every single day with a resolution of 3 meters by 3 meters for each pixel. This means that we will be able to monitor how cities are developing, where roads are being built, where traffic congestion is high, where forest fires are burning, what's happening to ecological destruction across the world, where ships are moving into protected coastal waters and overfishing in areas where they don't have licenses. The potential for using this kind of data to actually enforce some of the development implementation that has long been on the books but hasn't always been enforceable is now becoming enormous. I think that this is another area that offers massive potential for making development really better in the future. Thank you.
Well, I think we're going to end on those informative and, may I even say, inspiring words from both Rebecca and Homi. The hour's gone by quickly for us. We are really grateful for your active participation during this Hangout and in sending your questions ahead of time. And we look forward to your continued active participation over the coming several weeks. We do have one more Hangout during week 3, and we hope if you've gotten some benefits from this one that you will tune in 2 weeks. So it's to me to say goodbye, have a good afternoon or evening wherever you are, and look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.